Welcome to HR Trends. I'm your host, Claire Morin, and today we are very excited to welcome Ravin Jesuthasan and Greg Till for our final episode of season 1 of the HR Trends podcast. So we launched our podcast in the spring of 2020, just before we went home. We've been, talking throughout the past two years to HR, and there's really no better person to help us orient to where we are right now as we step into this third year of pandemic life than Ravin Jesuthasan. So Ravin is the global leader of Mercer's transformation services business. He's recognized globally as a thought leader, futurist, and author on the future of work and workforce transformation. He has led numerous research projects for the World Economic Forum, including many of its groundbreaking studies on the transformation of work and the global workforce. He's a regular participant and presenter at its annual meetings in Davos and is a member of the forum's steering committee on work and employment. He was named to the Thinkers 50 Radar class of 2020 and has also been recognized as one of the top 25 most influential consultants in the world by Consulting Magazine. Ravin, I could go on. Your bio is extensive, but welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Claire. It's lovely to be here with you and Greg.
And introducing Greg Till, the Chief People Officer of Providence Health Systems. In this role, Greg and his team aim to transform healthcare by bringing their innovative vision for the future of work to life. Using modern technology, unique partnerships, and grounded in Providence's mission, Greg's HR team has been able to effectively predict and shape labor needs, optimize workforce utilization, and significantly lower costs, while improving employee experience and strengthening the culture. Very important issues for our moment right now. Prior to serving at Providence, Greg held several leadership roles in field HR and talent at Raytheon Company, where he eventually served as the Chief Talent Officer. In these roles, he led the transformation of several key business segments and revitalized the company's talent system, leading to the organization's recognition as one of the top 25 companies for leaders in North America by Fortune magazine. So welcome, Greg.
Delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Claire. Nice to see you again, Ravin.
So Ravin, you've spent the past decade writing together with John Boudreau a series of acclaimed books about the transformation of work. Your latest book, launching on March 15th by MIT Press, Work Without Jobs. It feels amazingly relevant for our moment right now as we look ahead to try to understand our future. And I wonder if we could just begin with you reflecting on where we are. This is March 1st, 2022, in a world that just feels increasingly volatile, despite COVID on perhaps the downturn or reducing.
Yeah, Claire, it's really interesting. June of 2020, so about 3 months into the pandemic, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, very astutely observed that we've seen a 2-year trend in digitalization get realized in the first 2 months of the pandemic. And I actually think, if you look back over the last 2 years, the implications for the future of work have been far more profound, because the future of work is accelerated by two forces. Digitalization is certainly one of them, and as we can all relate with our Teams and Zoom and other calls. But it's also this other, what I think of as a far more powerful force, and some might argue a more insidious force, which is the democratization of work. So a growing ability to rapidly decouple work from its traditional confines of space, time, and structure. And I think when you overlay those two forces against each other, the impact on the future of work has been more like a probably 10-year trend that we've realized in these 2 years, maybe even more than that. Because, in the United States, Alvin Toffler wrote about in 1970 that, we'd soon be living in electronic cottages, liberated from the offices that we were in. And until March of 2020, about 50 years later, we were at a whopping 6% of all work being done full-time remote. And then overnight, we kind of hit 56% because of the pandemic. So just one example of that democratization of work, if you will. But to go back to your point about our previous books, our last two books, Lead the Work, Navigating a World Beyond Employment, and Reinventing Jobs, a four-step approach for achieving the optimal combinations of humans and machines, were really focused on starting with Lead the Work moving beyond the organizational boundary. It's kind of funny, actually, because John and I got some calls in the middle of the pandemic saying, that book you wrote back in 2015, we all sort of smiled politely and nodded when you talked about your framework and the evolution of work. But we went back and read it, and that right-hand side, that two state that you guys talked about makes complete sense now, because we're all living it. So, talk about sheer dumb luck, right? But that book really set the stage for this notion of work escaping employment. And the second book, Reinventing Jobs, really went deep into how automation comes into organizations, and more than the traditional narrative of jobs being substituted by automation, with about 130 case studies, showed how the impact is far more nuanced. It's certainly there's substitution of some tasks, there is augmentation of many others, and there's also the creation of new human work. And then we've got Work Without Jobs, which comes out, as you noted, later this month. And what all three have in common is this notion of deconstruction as a foundational element and capability for leaders to be able to transcend the challenges that they have to be able to navigate the opportunities that, such as they are, created by the volatility around us, to be able to navigate that with some agility. So at the heart of kind of the work that we've been doing, and Greg has got some marvelous examples of some of these ideas in action, is really this notion of deconstruction and reconstruction as a core capability for leaders.
It's fascinating, and particularly that sense you've just given us of the compressed time and the accelerated change and how the impacts we're all feeling in the labor market, right? And the exodus of people from jobs and so on. And in the book, you have this fascinating line around businesses are in this critical moment of recalibration. You call it a reset of our expectations, shifting from a relentless focus on growth and efficiency to a greater focus on resilience and agility. Could you hone in on that a little bit, this resetting of expectations, and why resilience and agility?
Just to start my response with a statistic, in December of 2019, the World Economic Forum surveyed the CEOs who are going to be coming to Davos in January and of 2020. And in that survey, they asked them about a variety of threats and opportunities and challenges to their business model. 10% expected a pandemic to be a major source of challenge to their business models. And yet, obviously, literally 2 months later, we were in the middle of what's been a massive upheaval. We talk about these black swan events as though they're the rarest of beasts. But if you think about it, we've had at least 3 major shocks, setting aside the chaos that we're now experiencing with the awful situation in Ukraine. In the last 20 years, we had 9/11, we had the financial crisis, and COVID. And so 3 quote unquote black swan events that, perhaps not quite as rare as we might have thought. And it's this need to be prepared for both shocks and opportunity that we see as really being at the heart of this pivot towards agility. We're seeing organizations question their traditional focus on growth, efficiency, and return as being the hallmarks of how they run their business, to increasingly saying, it's got to be more than that. There have to be these notions of resilience, agility, and flexibility baked into this. And I think, and the reason John and I wrote this book is, central to agility is the need to transition beyond the inflexibility of that traditional one-to-one relationship between a job and a job holder to the many-to-many between skills and capability and work. And I think that's one of the real lessons learned from the pandemic, is how many organizations demonstrated agility and resilience and flexibility by thinking beyond the job, by redeploying talent both within the boundaries of their organization as well as beyond in some cases, and moving to much more agile constructs of work.
And it's such a great lead into Greg, actually. So here's a chief people officer in the healthcare industry that's been at the front line of the pandemic, severe staff shortages, burnout. And Greg, really embodying our audience here as a people leader. Could you speak through, I know in the book, what you're doing is highlighted as a central case study. Can you speak through how you're putting these into practice, these concepts?
Yeah, first, let me offer a lot of gratitude. For those who haven't read John and Ravin's books, they're the precipice for a lot of the change that we're implementing at Providence. We've been thinking about this for several years based on a lot of their seminal work over the last 5 or 6 years, especially. And, the entire country right now is going through a workforce crisis based on the mass resignations that we've seen and job changes. But healthcare has been in a workforce crisis for 10 years. We've had more jobs open than people applying for our jobs for that period of time. As the population ages, especially in the last 6 or 7 years, you've seen a massive decline in births, a massive increase in deaths, and since the last administration, a pretty significant decline in immigration, which has always propped up the U.S. workforce. And so if you put all those factors together, in 2021, the population growth was the lowest that we've ever recorded it in U.S. history. And because of the dynamics in healthcare, we're experiencing that even more than most. And so we're really grateful as a start to Ravin and John for giving us some really creative ideas about how to approach it differently. I think they say the necessity is the mother of invention, and we've been thinking about how to solve our workforce challenges 20 years from now for the last 5 or 6 years. And to Ravin's point, that's only been accelerated through the pandemic, and we've gotten a lot more acceptance of some of the deepest changes. So while, like I'm sure most other HR professionals and strategists on the call, we have 4 big strategies. One of them is around inspiring our workforce. Another one's around really accelerating development. Another one's around enabling success. But the one that's most relevant to the 20-year strategy is the last one, and we call it transformation. Our transformation strategy, with a lot of thought about how Ravin and John are kind of constructing their framework, has 4 Ds. We try to keep it simple for our leaders and our workforce. The first D is deconstruct. How do we deconstruct the health system and the work? Looking both at the work itself and the workplaces. And so a couple of simple examples there. Clinicians typically spend right now about 30 to 35% of their time doing administrative tasks. And so we broke down every job element of a clinical person's role, asking ourselves, how could we automate that? How could we push that to a lower level in the organization? How could someone do that differently than they're doing it today? And during the pandemic, this was really critical because there was a massive shortage of healthcare workers. And so at that time, we did a skills analysis asking everybody in the organization who had special skills, certifications, capabilities. And we actually migrated people to the work based on those skills and abilities because of the deconstruction work that we had already done in the past. As Ravin mentioned, another part of that deconstruction is workplace. The most obvious example of workplace change is how most of the administrators, 20,000 caregivers at Providence, went virtual. Almost on day one, we saw the first COVID patients in one of our hospitals in Everett, Washington. And so we were pretty quick to send most of our administrators home. That said, we're also looking at how we can use sitters, scribes, and other professionals in other locations to help us to do what used to be clinical work, to make sure that the shortage of clinical staff, especially on the West Coast where we're located, is offset. And so that virtual work, or the flexibility that Ravin mentioned, doesn't just apply to the administrative positions, it also applies to some of our clinical positions. The second D, which Ravin also hit, is digitize the work. We need to automate our administrative tasks. We're doing that in 2 really cool ways at Providence. We're doing predictive hiring. We can predict hiring needs based on patient volumes and revenues with about 95% accuracy now. And so if an ICU nurse typically takes about 5 months to fill the job application because unemployment's 1.5% in that job category, we are actually able to open the requisition 5 months in advance of somebody leaving in order to eliminate the time to vacancy, meaning that we can still take care of patients on a continuous basis. We're also predicting scheduling. And so where we used to have nurse managers every other week doing schedules for 3 or 4 hours to make sure that they created the most optimal schedule, We're now using AI and ML to do nurse scheduling. Our computer software can spit out a schedule in about 10 seconds. And that schedule utilizes caregivers in a more optimized way, utilizing their preferences and also their desire for flexibility. And so that's something that's almost like the holy grail that we're using to increase our caregivers' engagement, decrease the capacity of our nursing leadership's roles. And at the same time, we're predicting that over the course of 12 months, that has likely saved us about $130 million on our bottom line because of our optimized schedules. The third and fourth, these are a little bit shorter. The third one is diversify. We need to diversify our sources of talent. We need to extend the retirement age, potentially certify and pay family members to take care of their family members. Look at international talent, utilize gig talent and agency like healthcare already does. Look at how we're utilizing talent from the Midwest and overseas to offset the West Coast shorting gaps. So lots of things that we're doing to extend the current workforce, both internally and externally. And then the last D is deploy. How do we utilize the folks that we have as optimally as possible? And I think in Ravin's book, he talks about migrating people to where the need currently is. And so we're utilizing a central system, again, highly enabled by AI technology and predictive tools to help us to really understand where the work is going to occur, utilizing a lot of different types of data and allowing people to kind of swarm to that work to make sure we're optimally utilizing the caregivers that we currently have, increasing their capacity and also being a lot more flexible in how we're scheduling them as well to increase their engagement. I mean, for me, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, engagement is the new, flexibility is the new engagement capital. And so a lot of what happens in the 4Ds enables a lot more flexibility in our workforce as well.
It's so fascinating to hear this. And I remember also hearing you on a wonderful live event, even giving the example of the average age, I think for a nurse, you said is 51. And yet we have this system where traditionally they're doing 12-hour shifts, right? And it's like, why? It doesn't actually make sense. And you were explaining that deconstructing those old ways of doing things. And Ravin, I wondered if I could bring it back to you on this too, because it goes what you were talking about, the democratization of work, where that 140-year-old construct of work is really changing, right? But you also said we're moving towards a more human enterprise where skills are the currency of work. And because often, obviously, depending on our audience and where they sit with the digital transformation, there's worries of this future, right? Of, is the human experience, the employee experience going to improve or be impacted? But I think you're both really saying, no, the human experience is going to be improved via this. And Ravin, I wonder if you could speak to that a bit. How is it going to become more human?
Yeah, happy to, Claire. And I think, you see the markers of that more human experience with Greg's wonderful examples, right? And if you think of just the evolution of work, when I do my speaking engagements, I often use a chart that shows how work has evolved from the second, third to the fourth industrial revolutions and what we're seeing emerge in kind of this future of work. And we've gone from, very structured approaches to work where humans were sort of cogs in the machine, right? You had incredibly tight and precise job definitions. You had job architectures that were really tightly bound to the way processes were executed. And you had that one-to-one relationship between a person and a position in very structured ways. And the first sort of chink in an armor was, as we entered the third industrial revolution and companies could, for the first time, look outside the organization and see the cost and capabilities and risk of work being done elsewhere by someone else. And it was the first time we introduced things like outsourcing and independent contractors and alliances, et cetera. And that was the start of the information age, or the information age, or the third industrial revolution, where we democratize information. And then, in the fourth industrial revolution, as it's been called by the World Economic Forum in 2000, we started to democratize work. We started to think of this notion of companies as platforms and open ecosystems. The notion of talent on demand and jobs and gigs really started to come to the fore. And as we all know, there was both a positive aspect in terms of access that came out of that, but also some really negative aspects that resulted in certain types of skills being commoditized and the value of those skills being sort of significantly declining relative to the cost of living, et cetera. I think as we get into where we are today, those two forces that I talked about, digitalization and democratization, I think we have an opportunity. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, Claire. I think we have an opportunity to seize that opportunity in much the way Providence has, to create that more human-centric enterprise where we have skills and capabilities really as the currency of work versus jobs. A much more human view that sort of uniquely sort of shows an organization the value, that unique bundle of skills that is Claire versus Greg versus Ravin, the opportunity for career paths to be truly individual. And I think this is where, because this is where AI, I think, has the potential to be truly an enabler of this democratization and putting the power back into the hands of individuals. We're seeing the consumerization of the enterprise, right? As more consumer-facing technology comes into companies, we're also seeing the enterprisation of the consumer as we look at the capabilities that are being put into the hands of our workforces. So I think we have an opportunity. Now, whether we choose to seize that opportunity and create that more human enterprise, I think remains to be seen. But I'm really optimistic with what we're seeing emerging and what's to come next with distributed autonomous organizations and the ability for capital to be democratized in addition to work and information. It gives me a lot of hope.
That's wonderful. And Greg, any thoughts from you on that, in practice at Providence Health Systems?
Yeah, I mean, one global thought is, I think 5 years ago, everyone was worried that technology was going to take their job. And one of my friends used to say, it's not going to take your job. It's just going to reduce the dull and the dangerous. And I really like that characterization. It's also going to give us a lot more flexibility and choice than we've ever had. And for me at Providence, we're applying some of those tactics and explaining how that relates to our current imperative around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, to the extent that we can open opportunities to a broader set of individuals, it creates more equitable and inclusive systems. To the extent we can get clear on critical skills and capabilities, as Ravin mentioned, it creates, we can select people without as much bias. To the extent we can allow employees to self-nominate for roles or projects or initiative, we reduce the barriers to growth and opportunities for everybody. And then if you include on top of all of that, the work from anywhere concept, it really increases opportunities for everybody, especially some folks that Providence cares a lot about, which is the poor and the vulnerable, who typically don't have some of those opportunities based on some of those barriers that we've seen in the past. And so that's what excites me about the democratization of work. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion at Providence, we're talking about how to inculcate some of that democratization into our processes that are defining the projects, the jobs, and the systems that allow people to get those in a way that ideally offers more opportunity to those that need it the most.
So inspiring to hear. And I do have to say, reading the opening chapter for the book, it's not come out yet, but I'll be getting my copy. But I have to say, personally, I was very inspired of, this is the new mindset, even in our own careers. This is how we need to be so flexible and creative, right, in this new world of work. And I wonder if we could kind of land on that to finish with the leadership skills needed in this new reality. So you've got some fantastic quotes from the book. One that I really love reads, "The new work system requires leaders, workers, policymakers, and the HR profession to prepare to be perpetually annoyed and exhilarated." I love that quote. And I wonder, Ravin, perhaps you could speak to it, and also Greg.
Yeah, I think at the heart of that dichotomy, if you will, Claire, is the fact that, this new work operating system requires us to transcend decades of legacy, which is going to be deeply annoying to many. But at the same time, it presents us with an opportunity to reinvent and realize the quantum gains that had previously never been available to us by virtue of implementing these ideas, and thus hopefully exhilarated. One of the things that John and I did in the book was to look at, what are the leadership skills that are being required of work in this new world. And I'll just call out 5 big changes quickly, and I'd love for Greg to sort of pile on because I suspect he can relate deeply to them. The first is from this tradition of hierarchical authority to more of leaders empowering and aligning across a diverse and disparate set of different interests and aligning those. From thinking of automation in a technical sense, as we often do, to a much more humanistic approach to automation. Literally questions like, just because you can automate it doesn't mean you should. If you haven't got a workforce that is capable of sort of adapting and to that automation, and frankly enabling that automation to realize its promise. From an episodic focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, when I hire someone, maybe when I promote someone, to a much more continual focus on DEI as we think of ever more agile ways of connecting talent to work. From what we talk about today of digital savvy to a much, much deeper technological fluency. And then lastly, from, going back to where, I was about 5 minutes ago with the process orientation that we've all grown up with, which is giving way to more of a human orientation. So from a focus on process execution to more of project guidance and alignment of talent to work in ever more project-based structures.
Greg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on leadership needed for the CPO or the CHRO.
Yeah, I think there's never been a more exciting time to be a chief people officer in our history. John wrote an article about 20 years ago about the 20 years post, Ulrich's HR business partner model, basically saying not a lot had changed in our executives' perception of HR executives. Now is our opportunity to do those things that Ravin talked about and to really see what the workforce needs to be 20 years from now and bring that future to life. We'll need to be innovative and entrepreneurial. We'll need to be effective change leaders with more influence than we've ever had. We'll need to make sure that we're flexible, adaptable, and resilient, and all those other things that Ravin mentioned. But I really believe that now is the best time, at least in the last 40 years, to really live into the promise of delivering value with and for our workforce, and just really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit more about that.
So wonderful. And final ask, if you could leave our audience with a few words of encouragement, so sending them out into this new world of work. Ravin, let's start with you. Key piece of advice you give them. Might be a hard question.
So I'm often reminded of William Gibson's infamous quote, right? The future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. John and I were just incredibly blessed to be, as we were writing this book, to be able to showcase, the future in the case of what Providence is doing, in the case what, companies like Unilever is doing, what Genentech is doing. So we were just incredibly heartened that many of the things that we were writing about and theorizing about, we were actually seeing world-class, market-leading examples in practice at Providence and the others. So I hope that's a source of encouragement to many.
That's wonderful. Greg, any words of encouragement since you're doing it on the ground?
I'll just say, don't let it be daunting. A lot of the things that are in Ravin's book, we in healthcare, because we're really highly regulated, can't implement wholesale. And so a lot of people post our last opportunity to speak together said, well, you're not exactly deconstructing every element of every job and making it all democratized. And I said, you're right, we're not doing that. But we're taking some really pragmatic aspects of a visionary philosophy and applying it in reality, and increasing value by hundreds of millions of dollars, improving our engagement, and allowing us to staff more effectively to our community's needs. And so while we're not taking the entire concept and philosophy and applying it wholesale, there are lots of really pragmatic things that every organization can do, even the ones that are the most highly regulated, that have the most history. Providence has 180 years of history and success blocking us from future innovation, but we're able to take that as an innovative organization, apply it, and really achieve a lot of value for our communities. And so I just really appreciate the forethought and the visionary frameworks that Ravin and John have offered, and would just like to inspire people that they are implementable and they add a ton of value and they're exciting as well.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on and inspiring us all. We're going to link to the book website from the show description so everyone can go there and get a copy, and hope to hear from you both again. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you, Claire. It's lovely to be here. And thank you, Greg. Always so much fun to do this with you, my friend.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much.
Unum is a registered trademark and marketing brand of Unum Group and its insuring subsidiaries.